Hello, everybody. I can't see you, but hello. Welcome to, this is the last of our media mentoring programs for the year. And I think this is one of the most important ones we've actually done, especially with local newspapers dying all over the country and the issues taking place in this country that are making people very unsettled. I thought that as part of this, I would just read the Commons mission statement. And by the way, I'm Lynn Barrett. As many of you know, I'm president of the board of Vermont Independent Media, publisher of the Commons. Our mission statement is Vermont Independent Media is founded on the belief that independent journalism is critical for the functioning of democracy and is the lifeblood of our community. Through its publication of the Commons, Windham County's independent nonprofit News Weekly sets a standard for fair, balanced, and accurate journalism, provides an open forum for diverse voices within its community. Through the educational dimension of its mission, which, by the way, is our media mentoring program, which we are in tonight, provides opportunities for discussion of important issues within Windham County, provides learning opportunities and internships for young adults and others who want to engage in the essential democratic functions of a free press. And with that, I will introduce Joyce Marcel, award-winning journalist, who will introduce our panel members, and the conversation will begin.
Thank you, Lynn. Hi, everyone. And I see we have a few reporters checking in. That's very nice to see. So our guest tonight, and we're honored to have him, is David Bornstein. He is the CEO and co-founder of the Solutions Journalism Network, which is working to establish a leading shift in journalism as an integral part of mainstream news. Sorry about this, I have to read. Rigorous and compelling reporting on responses to social problems is the name of the game here. Bornstein has been a journalist focusing primarily on social innovation for 30 years. From 2010 to 2021, he co-authored the Fixes column in the New York Times, which focused on social innovation. He is the author of How to Change the World, Social Entrepreneurs and the Power of New Ideas, which has been published in 25 languages. David, where are you calling from, or where are we seeing you from?
Hi, Joyce. I live in Manhattan. I'm in New York City. So
Great.
Yeah.
Okay, at least you're on the same time zone we are. So maybe you could tell us a little bit more about what you've done than just what I read, which is very brief.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I've been a journalist now for over 30 years, started my career working in newspapers in New York City. And, over the years, saw that journalism had a bias journalism struck me as sort of the first half of a doctor's appointment. It was very good at diagnosing what ails us and telling you where it hurts. But when it came to treatment options and what you could do about it, it really didn't focus on that role very much. And so over the years and over the decades, actually, my engagement with audiences has often been hearing, thank you for letting us know about the problems, but what can we do about them? And so in 2010, with my colleague Tina Rosenberg, another journalist, we started this column in the New York Times called Fixes. And it was really an experiment to see, can you do rigorous reporting that looks at how people are trying to solve problems, what evidence they have, whether it's working or not, and what you can learn from it, without falling into advocacy or puffery or feel-good journalism or any of the things that we would want to avoid. So we started that. It was originally a one-year initiative, but it proved to be quite popular. And we found that there were so many good stories to be told that they could be told rigorously without, and really surfacing helpful knowledge for society about how to do better against problems. So out of that experience, we started the Solutions Journalism Network 10 years ago to try to get that idea sort of integrated into the DNA of journalism on a much larger level. And so that's really what I've been focusing on the last 10 years. And we've worked with quite a lot of journalists, almost 50,000 at this point, around the world. And there's news organizations in many countries that are now using this approach on a regular basis. So that's kind of, yeah.
Thank you. That's interesting. I should introduce our other panelists. I don't know how I forgot. I'm married to one of them.
That's how you forgot.
That's how I forgot. Okay. First, we have Jeff Potter, who is the editor-in-chief of the Commons. And the other person is my husband, Randy Holhut, who is the news editor, sports editor, obituaries editor, and general factotum. And Jeff's number 2. So between the two of them, they are the Commons, and the rest of us are freelance writers who work for the Commons. And we're going to probably focus mostly on you, David, but I did have to get that in. Say hi, guys. Are you there? Randy, Jeff?
Thanks, Joyce. We're delighted to be here, and we're delighted that David is here, and I'm really looking forward to learning more about how we might reframe some discussions of some really heavy things that we're going through in the community, and any way that we can try to find ways to make things better without sacrificing ethics or integrity. That can only be good. So let's have at it.
Okay. Randy, did you want to say something?
Well, in being practitioners of community journalism, being as close to our readers as you can possibly get without having them publish the paper instead of us. It's the principles of solutions journalism are been filtered into the Commons DNA over the years, although in a more traditional sense. So we're looking forward to hearing some of the best practices of what others are doing.
Okay, thank you. I pulled a few quotes, David, from things that you've written. So I'm just going to read them now. I think journalism at its best should activate people to be powerful players in a participatory democracy. I don't think anyone would argue with that. The main way is that the news harms democracy is by providing a view of the world that is largely deficit framed. Journalists are often compared to watchdogs, but I begin to see that we were sometimes acting like bees, helping to cross-pollinate ideas. And I think maybe you want to, I have a definition here of solutions journalism, but we have you here, so tell us all about it.
Well, what's your definition?
1, describes a response to a problem and how it works. 2, seeks to draw out insights that explain success or failure. 3, presents the available evidence about the effectiveness of a response. And 4, explains the shortcomings or limitations of the response.
Yeah, that's those elements are, it's a way of telling stories about how people are responding to problems without falling into good news or sort of CNN hero kind of stuff. I mean, we actually don't like the phrase good news. We think that journalism should be helping people gain a greater sense of control to create the community that they want to create or the society that they want to create. And there's 2 types of information you need to do that. You need to understand what the threats and challenges are and what's causing the problems. And you need to know what your options are to respond to them. And so it's really a balance, of awareness, alerting people to what the dangers are. Like I was looking at the Commons from yesterday's edition, and you were focusing on, we've got a budgeting process coming up. There's a housing crisis in Putney emerging. There's mental health issues that you were reporting on. So people really need to understand these issues, but the efficacy around it, like how do we report on mental health so that we're continuously supporting the community to get smarter and learn from other communities. And one of the, I think, most interesting things that we've learned as we've worked, because we work with hundreds of news organizations around the United States, and a lot of them are local news organizations. And in some ways, there's almost a bit of a redefinition of what local news is. It's not always something that's happening in your community. It could be something happening in another community that is really useful to your community as well. So if there are other communities that are just doing like budgeting processes in interesting ways, like participatory budgeting, or they have other models, that could be a local story when you're doing your budgeting process. You know, and similarly, any issue that Brattleboro is dealing with, or there's 3,000 counties in the United States. There's always other counties that are doing smart things, and often smarter things, that we could all learn from. So the idea of importing ideas rather than just covering what's happening here, it's a big shift in the definition of local news. And one of the biggest issues that comes up when we talk with our local news partners is that they start to need travel budgets, which they don't have, because how do we go and cover these things that aren't in our community? And, you know, that's in some ways like, how do we import knowledge so that we can do better against things and turn the country into a resource for our community?
Could you give us just a couple of examples of this, the concept, the idea, the solution, the journalism involved, just so that we know what we're thinking about?
Yeah, I'll give you an example of a story that I covered when I was writing for the New York Times. So there's a big problem in the United States around childhood trauma. You know, many children and many adults have experienced what sometimes are called adverse childhood experiences. ACEs is the term that's often used. It turns out that many of these kids, if they're in an early childhood setting, like a Head Start program, for example, they're, because of the adversity and because of the fear that they've experienced, they have a real difficulty learning. They have a difficulty sometimes sitting still, making friends, and the teachers often don't know how to handle this. In fact, I found a statistic that early childhood suspensions and expulsions were even more common than high school expulsions, if you can believe that. These are kids that basically get kicked out of early childhood programs because their behavior is unmanageable for the teachers. So I looked at this and I did a lot of research on the problem. It was a growing problem. And so the first question you ask with solutions journalism is anyone doing better against this problem? Who are what we call the positive deviants? And so using data or research or reaching out to experts in the field, if you ask that question, is anyone doing better against childhood trauma? The experts will say, yes, you should go check out the Head Start program in Missouri, in Kansas City, Missouri. They're working with 3,000 kids in 30 settings, and they have a new methodology that's really showing success in terms of helping kids with childhood trauma learn how to adapt and stay present in class, and actually not only learn their ABCs, but make friends and be able to be on a trajectory for success. So I wrote that story. The headline of the story was helping children to calm themselves, because the methodology was adapted from a psychological process that actually teaches 4-year-olds how they can calm their bodies, which is a fascinating thing. Totally transformative for the kids, for the teachers, for the parents and the grandparents of the kids. And the thing that was really amazing from that experience, Joyce, was that after the story came out, I stayed in touch with the organization, and over 4 years, more than 200 other places in the United States implemented that model based on it was called the Head Start Trauma Smart model. So that was a huge, a huge kind of wake-up call for me, that when you are writing about a problem that's widely shared and you're able to highlight things that are helpful, that are credible. I mean, there was rigorous research that showed that this was working. There's lots of people that are looking for better methods, especially when you have something that causes as much suffering as childhood trauma. So in some sense, that's an example of something that we try to do all the time now.
So what's the main goal? Is it to connect ideas?
Well, so there's the main goal of our network, the Solutions Journalism Network, is to help news organizations around the country and around the world, one, feel confident that they can do this, so that it's actually legitimate to report on solutions. Because there's many news organizations and journalists that don't even think that we're supposed to do this. A lot of people say that's not our job. We're not in the business of burnishing people's reputations or picking winners. So there's a lot of resistance to that idea. So part of our work is to reduce that resistance. And then once the resistance is down, helping people actually, it's a practice. You know, I mean, there are different reporting techniques. There's different story construction techniques. And there's different ways to lead to better engagement and impact. So we help news organizations do solutions journalism, have real impact with it, get excited, and hopefully make more money from it. Because there's also a crisis in journalism that it's hard to, sustain your news organizations if people don't want to pay for it at the local level.
What major newspapers have adopted this?
What
major newspapers?
The BBC, the New York Times, Metro dailies in Los Angeles Times, most of the Metro dailies, or I would say a good portion of the Metro dailies in the United States, are using solutions journalism. CBS News just adopted it in their owner-operated stations. But we work with news organizations. I mean, we have a database called the Solutions Story Tracker, where we look for examples of solutions journalism that we think are exemplary. And so we have about 15,000 stories in there that come from almost 2,000 news organizations. And that's actually not even the full number of news organizations around the world that are doing this. There's 100 in Africa that are using solutions journalism as well.
Basically, when we do local journalism, we're doing that. We're covering as much of the positive, I don't want to say positive side because that's not what we're talking about, but the solution side, as well as the negative side. You seem to be talking about making it a network, an international network where we have available to us ideas from all over the world. Is that how this is working? Do I have that right?
Well, and I'd love to just, pull in Randy and Jeff about this, because, I think a lot of local news organizations really want to serve their community. And as you said, the community is really directing what the news is about. But that's pretty rare for the larger news organizations around the world. Certainly the regional and global news organizations don't function the same way. What are your thoughts?
Ran?
Well, I mean, there's been was for the longest time a reluctance for news organizations to cooperate with one another, because of course we're supposed to be competing with one another and trying and come up with scoops over the competition. And that's, as resources have dwindled over the years, there's been more of cooperation. The partnership that Jeff mentioned with Vermont Digger, which is the nonprofit newsroom in Vermont that's been wildly successful, they've made their reporting available to every weekly newspaper in the state of Vermont, except of course their biggest rival, 7 Days in Burlington. But all the others are the deal is we can use any Digger reporting. They can use any of our reporting, and some of our stories have gotten some wider play across the state who wouldn't have seen it before because of that cooperation. So I think cooperation has made a big difference in making stories less local and more regional and statewide. And it's also helped improve the reporting, because we can learn about what other parts of the state are doing and break out of our little silos. And I think Jeff could speak to that also.
Jeff?
Sorry, unmuting here. Yeah, I would agree with all of that. Randy, before I forget, I do want to make a slight correction to what you said about Digger. They make their reporting available to weekly newspapers under a certain circulation threshold. So it's not animosity toward a competition.
Well,
Um, and
it was phrased in a way that would eliminate 7 days.
well, whatever, well, I'll be more kumbaya about it than
Yeah, I'm the damn it part of it.
but regardless, it's been a huge boon for us and for a number of small papers in the state. It's added some depth to what we can provide. And I hope it's a benefit to, their mission of distributing their work more, in ways that they wouldn't have otherwise seen. So as far as the silos that you were talking about, Randy, I think I don't know. It's I'm sorry, I got 3 different
Well,
thoughts competing here.
The thought of, if something happens in Brattleboro, why should Burlington care about it? If Burlington's doing
Right.
something, why should Brattleboro care about it?
Well, and that makes it challenging for community newspapers where we have kind of a very strict geographic area. I mean, it's not like there's a moat around Windham County, but it's but just the nature of readership, you really have to, it's in the writing, and I think that really what we're saying here is that these stories could be written in a way that makes what's happening in Burlington relevant to readers in Brattleboro if we do our jobs correctly. Am I reading that? Did I kind of getting that vibe from what this is all about, David?
Absolutely. And it doesn't even have to be Burlington. It could be something happening in another country.
Oh
I
yeah, I mean, but just as a hypothetical,
Yeah.
it's not in our backyard. It's just being. I think that if we're doing our jobs correctly as writers and editors, it won't seem weird.
Yeah. I mean, if you take, for example, and this is why I think this is such a creative time for journalism and such an exciting opportunity. If you look at one of the major crises in the United States today, in the Western world, probably the whole world actually, it's the youth mental health crisis.
Mhm.
Everybody from the Surgeon General on down is saying that this is something that is really, really bad. If you look at the models for addressing large-scale mental health issues at low cost, none of them are in the United States. Most of the best models for dealing with, say, depression at a large scale at low cost are in the developing world. Some of the best ones are in Africa, because it makes sense. It's sort of necessity is the mother of invention. If you want to figure out how do you create a community-based mental health support network that doesn't rely on $100 or $200 hour therapy bills, you're gonna find that's being developed creatively. So there's an enormous amount of solutions-oriented journalism that could be done where we look outward from the United States to other countries to try to find ideas that we could bring back to Brattleboro or Burlington or New York City. And I would say, and getting back to your question, Joyce, one of the goals there is to get smarter together. And that means some of the getting smarter together actually could be getting smarter from the rest of the world, the whole world. Around COVID, which was a global problem, there was an opportunity to exchange ideas around safety nets, around adaptation that was actually at the global level. But some problems are just very, very locally based, and this model doesn't always work for every issue. But if you can answer the question, is anyone doing something better against this problem that we could learn from, you probably have a lead for some reporting that could be helpful to your community.
I think listening to you all talk, the word that's in the front of my head is Hamas. I don't think there's anything I can do about a lot of the things that I read in the papers that terrify me. And some of them are national and some of them are international. And outside of sending money to Doctors Without Borders, I'm not quite sure that this is even a possibility to talk about solutions journalism Should we be looking lower down on the scale, or do you have a way of dealing with these kinds of issues too?
I mean, look, in order to be able to write a solution story, you have to be able to answer the question, is someone responding to this problem in a way that is helpful or promising? So in the case of, what's happening in Israel and Gaza, you could look at, there are lots of groups right now that are actively out there doing things to try to rehumanize the other people on the other side of the fence. You see Israelis and Palestinians coming together. There's actually, I found a list of 7 stories that I was just looking for over a few hours of places where people are trying to actually come back to, I mean, if there is ever going to be a solution to this, it is because people decide to partner in some way. That is a necessary thing. And so where are the seeds of peace? Or there's actually an organization called Seeds of Peace where people are learning how to actually build bridges. This has been going on for 40 years. I mean, Israelis and Palestinians have been trying to do this for many years. You could also look around the world and say, where has peacemaking been successful? What does successful peacemaking look like? What are the models and the things? It's very hard to go back to what an individual in Vermont can do to help. I mean, obviously you could make donations and things like that, but understanding that there are models by which, horrible conflicts like this over time turn into better outcomes, and to look at the past, to learn from the past, that's one example of how this can be done. But the caveat is that solutions journalism is not really meant to be applied for breaking sort of news events. It's not something that you can pivot off super quickly. You have to you stand back and you say, what's happening here, and where are places that we can learn from? What other cities or what other countries what other situations? If we did a story, and we call these stories howdunits, they're sort of like detective stories. I mean, we think of them as a howdunit, which is like, how did this place do better? How did this community respond to its housing crisis such that 5 years later it's not as serious as it was? How did this community improve its education, or this high school improve its graduation rates over a 5-year period? So you have to, if you can write a howdunit, and and sort of the case of the school that increased its graduation rate, if you can actually find a story like that, then you have something that can be done. There are many, many stories, but certainly not for every issue.
Could you explain then how your system works? Does one pay to join this network? Is that where?
No. You're a journalist, and the network is thousands of journalists around the world that want to transform journalism, that want to make it radically helpful, rather than something that just speaks to the amygdala and makes people feel fearful and anxious and divided and disengaged, which is what journalism is doing now. All the research points to that. There's lots of journalists, especially younger journalists, that want to make sure that it's respectful, that it reflects the needs of their community, that it's genuinely helpful, that it advances equity, that it doesn't stigmatize communities by defining them in terms of their problems or their deficits. And so these are people who want to do this. They realize that there's problems with the current system. Nobody is defending the current system right now. And they join the network to learn from others, to share resources, to contribute resources, to be able to, we have trainers now in close to 50 countries. These are people who volunteer to go through a training program to be a solutions journalism trainer. We don't make them do it. We have so much demand for this that we're way behind. We have, we had 50 people apply for the last training we did, and we could only accommodate a third of that number. So the motivation, especially for young people, for young journalists, to tell better stories is very strong. And the network is a way that they can discover how to do that. They can find their friends, moral support. They can come up with arguments. They can find editors that are receptive to these stories that they can pitch them to. And probably the biggest single issue that journalists around the world want to apply this lens to is the climate crisis. because it's very clear that covering the crisis through the lens of it's both apocalyptic and unsolvable, which is what journalism does often, is terrible. It disengages people. It leads to motivated denial. It leads to political polarization. So journalists around the world are very, very clearly wanting to change the coverage to focus on possibilities. What is the adaptive resilience that's available? And so, our job is to try to get the capacity to spread as quickly as possible in news organizations so that it becomes easier to do it. People have the motivation, but there are still there's still trainings and processes that are helpful to people when they actually want to engage in this type of journalism.
Are you funded then by grants?
Pardon me?
Are you funded by grants?
Yeah,
Or how do you
funded by
fund
grants.
this process?
Large, mostly large American foundations.
Okay, then someone just joins the network and has access to all these different ideas?
Yeah, you can just sign in, go in. You can, and it's all free. We make
Right.
grants to news organizations. We have fellowship programs. There's lots of opportunities. We have training programs. If you're interested in applying for a fellowship, if you work in a news organization, you can, the news organization can apply for various subgrants or opportunities, reporting opportunities. When a foundation is interested in solutions journalism around, let's say it's health. We want more solutions journalism focused on health or youth mental health, let's say. So we'll create a fellowship and see if journalists around the world are interested in covering that. And we never tell them what they can write about. The goal is the thing is focus on solutions journalism is one of the things that is encouraged, but it's not. It's people can still do the reporting that they do, and the topic is something that people are motivated to write about.
Okay, I want to just express that people who have questions should be putting them in the chat or raising your hand. We'll call on you. You know how to raise your hand. There's a button at the bottom or somewhere on your screen that will let you do that. And right now in the chat, we have someone who wanted to ask us about the 3 Palestinians shot in Burlington. And so this is something that's shaking us up very much right now. And there are protests about it all over the state. And I am willing to place my money on the fact that mental health will come into it in the end. And this guy who shot the 3 Palestinians, all of whom are alive, as far as I know, thank God. But this has now become an international story in our little state, which has been relatively safe. How does solutions journalism approach this?
Like I said, the stories what are the stories that are helpful here? Who's doing better? What stories can be helpful when you have a conflict like this, a war like this? So stories that show and humanize the people on the other side, the people that you have excluded from your empathy. A lot of this is driven by, as you said, I think that there are mental health issues, but it's driven by hatred. It's driven by fear. One of the most powerful stories, according to research, that can be told when you're in an intractable conflict is a story that forces you to flight simulate someone else's experience, to actually jump into their experience, that humanizes them, or stories that show people from the group that you're opposed to or that you may hate protecting the group that you're part of. And so you can now see news reports and stories that are, some of them are on social media, of people showing, Israelis or Jewish people standing up for Palestinians and vice versa, Palestinians. Those are the kinds of stories at a time like this that may be helpful. The research says that those are useful stories to tell. In terms of being able to change the policies of governments. We don't, obviously journalists can't do that.
Yeah, that's definitely one answer. We have another question, but it's about Palestine. I don't think we really want to get into that that conflict. Jeff, did you want to say something, or are you playing with the cat?
Well, I'm trying to avoid playing with the cat. But I actually did want to ask David. Now you mentioned polarization. One thing I'm concerned about is existing polarization of readers, who really I've found on certain issues, maybe up to and including this recent one, really come in with a lot of very, very strong pre-existing views. How does your research and how does your experience deal with contentious issues that in a fractured community and their response to journalism that seeks to be more positive? Are they cynical, or is there a demonstrated experience of winning over hearts and minds to really think through something that people have already thought they have thought through?
Yeah, we started getting into this question after during the 2016 election, and shortly after it actually. We saw that, and a lot of people saw that journalism wasn't making a difference. People were deciding, people weren't even, it didn't matter what facts you were marshaling. You could say, Google, all these news organizations started getting fact checking, and this is how, it didn't make a difference. Facts didn't seem to matter. When people are in a state of what's called high conflict, which is what the conflict mediators call it, there's almost nothing you can do in terms of convincing people out of a position that they're in. But it turns out what we did is we said, okay, so what would conflict mediators do? And we actually engaged a journalist, a really brilliant journalist named Amanda Ripley, to do research looking at the question, what would journalists do if they knew what the best conflict mediators in the world know? How would they approach their role as reporters? And that was the question. And she wrote an essay, a really brilliant essay on our website, which is on our blog. I highly encourage anyone to read it if they're interested in the question that you just posed. The essay is called Complicating the Narratives.
Mm-hmm.
And literally, if you just Google the phrase complicating the narratives, it will be the first thing that comes up on search. And you can read it or listen to it. But what it does is it explains what high conflict is, which is the state that we're in now. Not, we're in it about a bunch of issues, but we're certainly in it when it comes to politics in the US. And it explains how journalists can approach things differently to get better results, which is to say, to work with people. And, one of the most important things that you can do in a state of high conflict is actually listen in a different way. Conflict mediators are very intentional about the way that they listen and the way that they loop, what's called looping their audiences, which is a form of listening where you give proof to the person you're listening to that you really are listening. You don't just nod your head. And what that does is that creates a bit of safety in the conversation, and then people are more willing to be somewhat more curious rather than just, totally grounded in their judgment. So we have a whole program and a fellowship called the Complicating the Narratives Fellowship now, where we have journalists who are trained in this approach, who are bringing it into different news organizations and so forth. And it is really, it is trying to bring the wisdom of conflict mediation to journalists. Journalists are not conflict mediators, but they can adopt some of the practices that are in the tool belt to certainly not make things worse. And so that would be one part of your question. And if people are interested in it, Amanda also, the journalist who wrote Complicating the Narratives, also wrote a really fantastic book, which is called High Conflict. Mm-hmm. And it does very well right now. It's probably the best book out there in the US that really can help people understand what might be more skillful today when you're actually talking to people on the other side of the fence about whatever the issue is. Certainly it's good for Thanksgiving dinners and things like that. And
I'm
and-
sorry. I didn't
yeah,
mean to-
the other piece to your question, which is what actually happens when you do solutions journalism at a local level? Is that inherently depolarizing? And what we have found is that the question of trust of a news organization is an interesting one. Journalists often think, you should trust me. I did my homework. I'm accurate. These are the facts. That's not actually how trust always works. Factuality is important, but it's more like, I trust you because you have my back. I trust you. I don't care what you know until I know that you care. Trust is very often a function of a relationship, a function of believing that the people you're listening to actually really care about you. And it turns out that even if you're accurate, if you're telling people stories every day that freak them out and make them feel scared and depressed, even if they're accurate, people aren't necessarily going to give you their trust. They're not going to give you their love for sure. So being helpful to people, really radically helpful to people, like you told us you're really worried about your teens in the community. We're going to do a 10-part series that looks at smart things that communities are doing to help their teens be happier and healthier, because we care about our community. If you want to do that, what you'll do is you'll see more trust go up. We've seen this anecdotally around the country. And then you will actually see less polarization when it comes to, oh, that's that newspaper, that's that reporter that did that great series on the teen mental health. Now he's writing about the climate crisis, or she's writing about the climate crisis. So, the halo effect of being helpful can really, really be useful in a very polarized situation.
Thank you. I really appreciate the depth of those responses. And just so everybody knows, I put links to both Amanda's book and the original article in the chat notes if you want to take a look at it sooner than we can get that out to you.
Good. Okay, we have a question. I think it's a question. It's a long one. We're a long way from the front page in Citizen Kane. My brother's a seasoned journalist. I'm not. This is a freelance writer who's writing. But a cooperation and a sharing of resources only makes sense if we intend to help sustain and promote what is good and what is working in society and culture today, when circumstances are pretty dire and needs for solutions are urgent. I guess that's not a question. That's just a fairly wise sentiment.
Yeah.
And reporter from Essex says, but yes, not covering relevant stories or the other side of the story is important. Well, yes. We're getting a lot of questions now. I'm going to try to keep up with them. Someone is saying, I was a camp counselor one summer at a youth program in Virginia that aims directly at having kids from world's trouble spots get to know each other as people by living together and having fun at camp. I haven't been in touch with them for a while, but they aimed right at the Israeli-Palestinian dynamics. And there's a link to something. This is an example of a solution-focused activity that could inspire other activities. Great. In Brattleboro, here's someone else. In Brattleboro, there are a host of related problems in downtown: panhandling, shoplifting, homelessness, active drug use, etc. Is there a town in Vermont or elsewhere that has addressed these issues and is making a difference? David?
There are a lot of communities in the United States that have made seen a dramatic reduction in homelessness. There's actually an organization called Community Solutions that tracks this phenomenon across the United States. It's the website is CMTY Solutions, and there are some communities that have, there's different dimensions to homelessness. There's chronic homelessness, which is defined in a particular way, and that usually is associated with oftentimes, not always, but with mental health issues and with other health complications, often with a traumatic brain injury. There's family homelessness, which is usually associated with the housing problems in the community. And then there's youth homelessness, which is often associated with young people, leaving their families because of, problems in the families or abuse in the families or things like that. Sometimes they're very different problems, and they require completely different strategies to deal with them. But in each case, there are communities that have done really, really well in reducing these problems. Chronic homelessness seems to be the one that more communities have had the most success with, because the solution, which is basically permanent supportive housing with wraparound services and a housing first model, is very successfully applied in lots of places. So yeah, I would say that's a classic case where solutions journalism could bring in ideas into the community that are being used in other places and could perhaps improve the local response.
Then there's a question, would Tracy Kidder's book, Rough Sleepers, qualify as solutions journalism?
Oh gosh, I haven't read it. What's it about? I love Tracy Kidder. He's one of my favorite authors.
Okay, it's a book we've been talking a lot about in Vermont right now. It's the story of a doctor in Boston who ministers to the homeless. I think he's got a 40-year career of doing that and how he does it. And Tracy Kidder just hung out with him and followed him around and took notes. Wrote a great book.
Kind of like what he did with Paul Farmer.
Pretty much.
Probably very likely, sounds like it. Now I'm going to read it.
You should read it. There's another book, I forget the name of the author, but he wrote the answer to homelessness is homes.
Actually, we linked to that story you wrote about interviewing him.
If I could remember his name or the name of the book, do you?
It's I think that was the name of the book, as well as his talk, and it was two authors. I'll have that in just a second, Joyce.
Okay, or link to my story. That explains everything. In the meantime,
So can I just add another thing to the homelessness question?
Sure.
Because this actually gets to the question of, there's a lot of people in journalism that feel, that still believe the idea, if it bleeds, it leads, that bad news does better than, more helpful news. So the New York Times has a solutions journalism series. It's called Headway. It's actually in front of the paywall, so you don't have to be a subscriber to go to Headway. It's a solutions oriented series that looks at a whole series of problems. And one of the things that they looked at last year was how the story was about how Houston, Texas, had housed 25,000 homeless people successfully. It was a story that really looked at it, the how done it of that. How did they do it? And the reporter, Michael Kimmelman, who wrote the article and who's one of the leaders of the Headway series, told me that it was the most Instagrammed story in the history of the New York Times, and one of the top stories of the whole year that it came out in last year. And so we were talking to him because, he was saying, we're seeing that this stuff actually does really well and this was a long story, a long, very detailed account of how Houston had actually made these changes and was doing better than other cities. So, I wish more news organizations and editors understood that audiences really want information that is well written, really good storytelling, but also helps them understand, just as you said, what can we do about these problems that we see every day in our community?
Okay, I have a question from a journalist. What is the difference between solutions journalism and advocacy?
One is not journalism. Advocacy is when you have a position and you're pro this and you're out there saying everyone should do this thing. Journalism, if you want to look at how our community is reducing homelessness, you go to a whole bunch of communities, 5 or 10 of them, and you look at what are the models that they're using, and you look at what's the evidence of success, what is the cost, which ones are politically doable, and then you report them and you let the local community decide whether or which approach they would use, if any. But you're not pushing one approach over another. The advocate believes that, they have the truth. That's why they're advocating for it. The journalist is humble and says, I'm going to report on something. I'm going to tell you what they're doing. I'm going to tell you the results that they're getting and what perhaps we might be able to learn from it. But I'm not picking winners. I'm not the broker of the decision here, or the decision maker here, in terms of what any community can do, because there's so many other variables that could come into play that you're not aware of. And even who gets to decide something's a solution or who gets to decide something's a problem, that in itself comes from a particular perspective, and it will feed into all sorts of racialization as well in this country.
Okay, someone is saying, and yet solutions journalism seems to be edging towards advocacy. It makes sense, especially in this troubled world, to take journalism in the slightly new direction, yet the question persists.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's the area that you have to always push against. This is not advocacy. How do you do this reporting? One of the reasons our network exists is to train journalists in how to do solution reporting without falling into advocacy. So looking at the limitations, looking at the caveats, saying this is working well in these 3 schools, but they have a lot of money, or they've only done it with 100 kids. The idea that when you're reporting on a response to a problem, there's always going to be limitations. There's always going to be things that you have to talk about. Oftentimes things won't work. The idea is to be as this gets back to what journalism is. Journalism is ultimately trying to describe something without promoting it. This is what happened. This is what the evidence is according to these people. And we're putting it forth. The society decides what to do with this information. That is really why it's important to have journalism schools teach this approach, because if you just treat it as feel-good news, as everybody should do something, then you're not doing journalism at all anymore.
Exactly.
Okay. Go ahead, Jeff.
I would say that for anybody who's worried about this sort of journalism not being journalism, or going down a slippery slope into advocacy, I would promise you, as an editor of a newspaper, that I wouldn't let that happen. I think that's the spirit in which David's sharing these ideas, where we're which is really mixing the traditional values of journalism with fresh approaches that might engage communities and just add more grist to the mill when we're talking about problems that we're writing about. And I don't, and I see that as I see elements in what you're describing, as we've done a little bit of this here and there over the 18 years that I've been, or not 18, I picked that 15 years I've been at the Commons, and I know, and the other, there are a lot of other papers represented in the audience here, and that have done the same. So I don't think this is anything particularly new. I think the focus and the the intellectual rigor and the resources, David, that you're bringing to this is what is very new about this approach. And I'm not worried about it, and I don't think the people who are really apprehensive in the comments should be worried about it either. We're not going to let anything bad happen.
Yeah, good editors. We used to do as part of the original training when we started going into news organizations, and people were really resistant to the idea of solutions journalism. Everyone's arms were folded. That's not our job. We found some data about hospital cesarean rates. And we found 2 hospitals that had the same name. One of them had a very high cesarean rate, and they brought it down dramatically. The other one had a low cesarean rate, and it had gone up quite a bit. And we'd show the data to the journalists. We wouldn't say anything. We'd say, which one is the story? Everyone said the hospital that's doing worse is the story. Nobody said the hospital that's doing better is the story. But the whole point is that the hospital's doing worse is an outrage story. It's a story that's supposed to, draw attention to a negative. But in the other story, that's where all the knowledge is. If you want to learn how to reduce cesarean rates, you're going to get it in the other story. So in fact, both of them are the stories. The story about calling out the hospital that's not really being responsible in terms of its cesarean. We're assuming that these are unusually high rates. They shouldn't be that high. And the story that understands, how did this hospital bring it down? Was it leadership? Did they change practices? Were they doing better screening programs? Whatever it is, if you put both of those together, if you combine outrage and knowledge, you get change. And that's the idea that we're trying to bring to journalism. We're trying to round out journalism. So it's not just all outrage and problems, but you don't want it to be all solutions and sort of Pollyanna stuff. You want to pull together outrage and knowledge so that people have the knowledge they need to create the community they desire.
I can't help but think that the obvious answer, if we take the drug problem, which we have a serious drug problem in Brattleboro, the solution, or the one place, the one country I know that handled it well, was Portugal. And you write that what we need are big houses where people can go and get high, and the needles can be checked and be clean, and their drugs can be checked for fentanyl, and et cetera, et cetera. If you started writing that story, you could possibly get into a lot of trouble in this country. And you certainly will never make change, because that story has been out there for, I don't know, half a decade.
Yeah, I mean, Vancouver, Canada has been doing harm reduction like that for ages. There's lots of harm reduction stories that are, you would want to, there's so many that you would want to find one that's actually much more, very relevant for Brattleboro in terms of its demographics, its size, the particular drivers of the problems. But harm reduction there's lots and lots of examples of places that have done, very, very well with that. And Portugal has also done really remarkable things with its prison system as well.
Okay, we have another question. How do you visit a community when most local papers don't have funds to travel or time to research, or places where when one reporter is doing the job of 5 people?
This is a problem we deal with all the time. You ultimately, news organizations say to us, we don't have time to do solutions journalism. We're doing all these things. And the first thing we ask them to say, have you surveyed your audience and asked them what they actually want from the news? And most of the time when they actually do the survey, not very many do these surveys, the audience says, we want more news about solutions to our problems. That's actually usually the #1 content request when news organizations actually do the survey. So what happens is they have to let go of other things that they're doing that are using up the resource, and move some of the resources over to be able to pay for the things that the community is asking for. And then the other thing is, we have many news organizations in our network that have gone to local community foundations and businesses for sponsorship and said, we're gonna go out and we want to do an extensive series looking at homelessness, or looking at mental health, or looking at drug issues through the lens of what can we learn that will be helpful to our communities, and we'd like you to fund it because you're the community foundation and you care about the health of the community. And you don't have any say over the editorial, but you are part of helping the community have the knowledge it needs to solve its problems. And in many, many cases, that's how they get new funding. You know, that's also available. A lot of news organizations have never even tried that. You know, and news organizations that are for profit don't realize that they're allowed to do that they're actually allowed to get grant funding to do that. So there are other sources of funding, including contributions from individuals as well. And showing people that the journalism is going to be part of a process of helping our community deal with its problems often makes it easier to be successful when you're asking the community to contribute.
And someone else asks, why is there resistance to solution journalism, and where does it come from mostly?
There's a phrase in journalism that is kind of like, you know, it's like a catchphrase that captures the spirit of the profession. And, you know, Randy and Jeff will be familiar with this, and you yourself. Sunlight is the best disinfectant, right? Right? The idea that journalists kill germs. We disinfect. We shine the bright light of awareness and exposure onto the dark corners of our institutions, and we essentially kill the germs. We're disinfectant. So if you think of yourself as disinfectant, if you think you're, you know, back penicillin or something, you spend your days looking for germs to kill. And if there's an antibody floating right in front of you, just push it away. You're saying, I don't have time to look at you, antibody. I'm looking for germs to kill. So people, if you have an assumption about what your role is, and if your identity is formed around that role, when someone comes to you and says, there's another way to tell stories, you're like, I catch bad guys. Don't bother me with the good school or the school that's doing better. That's not a story. And then there is this fear of advocacy, this idea that if I write a story about a place or a school or a hospital or a police department or what have you, that's actually improving, I'm going to be labeled an advocate, and all my journalist buddies are going to, you know, make fun of me when we go to the bar, kind of thing. I mean, there really is, that sounds like a cliche, but it's actually true. There's a professional insecurity about writing solution stories. And part of why the network exists is to legitimize it, normalize it. Lots of people now have won awards for this, you know, so the more they can see, oh, the BBC does this, the New York Times does this, the Guardian does this, it creates professional safety for people to do something that many journalists say to us, you know, I always wanted to do this. You know, it's kind of like middle school. They wanted to do it, but they were afraid what their friends would say, about what their friends would say. And, you know, in some ways, like, yeah, so assumptions have to change. And you know, so now it's a very broad global network. And if our organization, you know, went away tomorrow, it would probably still continue to grow.
It occurs to me as a reporter, my instinct is to write something new, or if I hadn't heard it before, if it's just happened, and it wouldn't have anything to do with getting the bad guys or shining a light on the good guys. It would just be, this is the newest idea, act, person, whatever. And so that's what I should be writing about next, because it hasn't been written about before. That is, it doesn't seem to be one way or the other in my mind, or the way I report.
Yeah, well, there's lots of scoops. It's, you know, it's an undiscovered continent of stories, you know?
Okay, I have a question here. I'd like to go back to climate change. It's such an overwhelming problem, and we seem to be going more and more backward. How do you find examples of solutions that are working, that aren't just false hope? No matter how much, for example, some European countries are doing, climate change worldwide is still getting worse.
In the case of climate change, you kind of have to slice it up in different ways. So there's obviously, if you look at mitigation at the global level, it's not a happy story, but you can look at places that are reducing their emissions. There are states, there are regions, there are countries. How are they doing it? How did the policies get made? What's the technological side to that story? Then you also have stories of adaptation, like, you know, the summers are getting hotter or wetter or drier in different parts of the world. How are farmers adapting? Are they adapting farming practices? For much of the world, global warming is still a poverty problem. Their their yields are down, or it's a weather problem. There's fires or there's flooding. You know, how do you do manage retreat well? Which communities have done manage retreat the smartest ways without tearing the community apart? What are food systems? You know, South Korea has reduced its food waste by 95%. How did they do that? You know, America could really benefit from learning how South Korea did. There's so many stories that if you actually look at the world through the lens of different dimensions of the problem, you know, mitigation, adaptation, resilience, these are all things, there's thousands of stories to be told in each of those categories. I mean, if you look at the global sink of the problem, it's very, very scary. And it's, you know, but once again, you know, there's technology stories, there are stories about, you know, what are the public policies, or which countries are making the most headway around things like carbon taxes and things like that. How does that get moved forward in a political environment? You know, really, once you, if I would encourage people to look at the Drawdown project, which was something that Paul Hawkins started many years ago, or he was one of the founders, because they look at many categories of global warming solutions. And within each of those categories, they tell you how important that particular dimension is to reducing the overall, you know, sort of pie of the problem. And then with each of those categories, you then can look at many, many kinds of stories within those categories. We have in our solution story tracker on our website, as I mentioned, we have more than 15,000 stories in it. If you put in climate change or environmental protection, you'll find thousands of stories that look at the different ways that communities have been adapting.
Okay. Here's a comment. Years ago, Francis Moore Lappe lived in Brattleboro and tried to create a news network for sharing positive news stories. Not so much to share solutions, but positive in other ways. And the network did not survive long term. Do you know about about her experiment?
I do. And it's someone who's been, you know, a hero for a long, long time. You know, I think that the positive frame is actually a problem. There are positive news organizations or news organizations around the world, and they're all relatively small. You know, they might have 30 or 40,000 readers, and there really is something about the framing of news as positive that actually doesn't seem to harness, you know, the powerful sort of human emotional forces that are needed to drive a lot of consumption of that news thing. So we don't look at it as positive. We basically say the news should reduce your suffering. You know, if you're suffering, if you have a lot of homelessness, or the economy, you know, your local economy, if young people are leaving the town and they don't want to come back, and you're worried about whether you're even going to have a future of your town in 20 years, those are real pain points for people. And there's lots of them. If you produce news that reduces people's pain, that gives them a sense of agency over the things they really care about, it's not positive. It's powerful ideas that speak to people's most urgent needs. That's different than good news. And the framing has to be totally moved away from. Good news feels like it's cat in a tree kind of stuff.
Okay. Moving on to a terrifying subject. Is there a place for AI in solutions journalism?
We just actually sort of formed a partnership with an AI company to develop an AI classifier, which is like a tool that will tell you if you're looking for news, you can say, I'm looking for news about homelessness, but I want to prioritize solutions journalism. This doesn't exist yet, but that's the idea. So I think that that would be helpful to people because, you know, our idea is that if people could request stories that help them understand the agency around an issue, it would drive more news consumption that would actually be helpful to people in solving problems. In addition, if you could say, hey, I'd love to, you know, show me all the solutions journalism about agriculture in sub-Saharan Africa, you know, over the last 12 months. If you could actually answer that question and now use AI, pull out the 10 patterns that run through those stories. That could be a really interesting use of the technology to quickly surface strategic insights and patterns about how people are adapting in real time to, you know, this historic crisis, the climate crisis. So I'm very worried about AI. I think it's really scary. But in terms of using journalism as a better knowledge management system to actually get knowledge to people to learn more quickly, it could be very helpful in that regard. But, you know, that's with a caveat of there's lots of scary stuff around it.
Okay. How will you know when you have accomplished what you set out to achieve?
Oh, that's a hard question. We try to figure out how to measure, you know, how do you measure a global adoption of a new idea? You know, so the number of news organizations that are participating in this, the number of journalists who say that it matters to them to do solutions journalism. So there's ways of surveying it. The number of news organizations that actually are making money and say that one of the reasons why we're still in business is because we changed our product. Our community says it tastes more like a latte and not an instant coffee. It's a better product. It's something that doesn't depress me, doesn't make me feel fatalistic and paralyzed. It actually helps me understand how I can get up in the morning and do something. I think there's going to be many different things that, if it works, will sort of show that it's working. You know, but we've seen, yeah, we also go to journalism conferences, and you know, how many tracks are there about solutions journalism? Like there used to be 0, and now you go to them, and sometimes in some conferences, like when I was at the International Journalism Festival, which is held in Italy every year, I went there last year. Almost every conversation about climate change journalism ended up landing on solutions journalism as something that has to happen. And that's completely different than even 2 years ago. So I would say that feels to me that it's spreading, but you know, the tools to measure it precisely are very hard.
Okay. I've run out of questions. This is my cat, Agatha Kitty. Sorry about that, but
Perfect for a how done it.
Obviously. And when did you want to open up the questions to the floor?
Yeah, sure.
Is that why all these in caps comments are in the chat? Or does anyone else have a question out there? Jeff, Randy, would you like to comment on what we've been hearing? Randy, you haven't said anything. Go ahead.
Well, it's more positive than I thought. It confirms a lot of what we're doing right and points to things we can do better. But certainly, I'm coming away from this with a little bit better idea and hope for it than I started with. And I guess that's what the point of this all is.
Yeah.
Jeffrey?
I think that, and I think Randy, you put it best when you say that that really these ideas are really embedded in the Commons DNA. I think in terms of executing them more with more deliberation, it's a matter of resources, as with anything. But I really, I guess I keep coming back to this whole thing got me thinking about the conversation I had with my mentor in the first newspaper I edited back in the late 80s. And she was kind of an old school community journalism. I mean, she hated the word journalism. She was a publisher more than an editor. She liked putting pictures of animals on the front page. And we had a healthy tension with where she thought that stories that were going, that were too negative were really negative, and not I don't know, kind of not fitting the spirit of her newspaper. And I always made it a point to try to make stories that even when they had to be negative, really took a positive spin, because a community that that knows what's going on, you can't confront a problem unless you know about it. And I think tone is a lot of what we're dealing with here. The tone in which you and the personality that you imbue into the pages of your newspaper or your website is going to go a long way toward getting people to see through the lens of that this is not bleeding and leading, but really, we take no joy in bringing you this information, and what are we going to do about it? And I think we've got a good readership in Brattleboro for not only our paper but for the Reformer, and the good things that they're doing too, and trying to I don't know where I'm going with this. It's late, but it's I'm really happy to have this conversation and to have these ideas, and to do to find new lenses to look through our community, and to share those new ways of looking at it with readers who are hungry for solving these problems.
Really, in one of your reporters, Annie, has just sent in a solution. In the realm of solution stories, a church in Brattleboro has committed to going to 100% energy sustainability by 2030 and raised a lot of dough very quickly to that end. It's a good story to perhaps inspire other entities, nonprofit and for-profit, with roofs to follow as an example. And I know the organizers of this church would be totally game to sharing their how-tos. So you could tell her to write that story, I guess.
We'll talk.
And someone else answers, if you report on, for example, how some towns are successfully dealing with homelessness, shouldn't you also report on towns that are failing to solve the problem? And I think that the whole point of this conversation is that we do a whole lot of one, and we might want to think about doing some of the other. Am I right, David?
I would agree. Yeah, I think we do. And I mean, reporting that the problem is not being solved, that there's many reasons why it's not being solved. Sometimes, people don't care enough, people aren't serious, they're not really doing their jobs. Sometimes there have been good faith efforts that haven't worked, and they actually don't know what would be more helpful, what would work better. And there's in journalism, we always just kind of assume when a problem is not being solved that it's because of sort of incompetence or negligence, or sort of, just like the government is just, not doing its job. Very often there's a lot of people working very hard, and they just don't understand, some dimension of it, and they're not succeeding. I'll give you a simple example. One of the biggest challenges in US hospitals is getting doctors to wash their hands on a regular basis. If when they do that, infections go down and patients don't get sick in the hospital. It turns out it's very, very hard. If you're a doctor, you see 80 patients or something like that, to remember to wash your hands 80 times is just very hard. And there's countless experiments about how to do this. If we place the hand washing station 10 feet to the left, it increases compliance by 38%. I mean, there's all of these things that people have actually done. It's actually a really hard problem to solve. It's not just because people are lazy or they don't care. It's a really, really complex behavior challenge. And so many things in our society actually are like that. And if we moved away from shaming and blaming people as thinking that that's the thing that's necessary, to, you know, like better to light a candle than curse the darkness. Like, where is it working? And then let's look and see, what are they doing differently? And there might be some really simple insight that makes a whole lot of difference. And it's surprising how often that is the case.
Okay, well, we are out of questions. You have said, I think, pretty much what you wanted to say. And we've been a good audience, I hope, for you. So thank you very, very much for taking the time to speak to us. And
Thank you.
we'll call it a night at
It's a
8:22.
pleasure. I look forward to being back in Brattleboro soon. And
Oh, you've been here.
yeah,
I didn't know that.
my dear friend Kevin O'Keefe and Erin Miley O'Keefe, who do the luau, and you were mentioning other things, live there. So I come, and I love it.
Well, great. Maybe we'll see you when you get up here again.
Yeah, give us a
Look
holler
forward-
when you're here. I'd love to grab a coffee.
That would be great.
Yes. Okay,
And
thanks
if,
very
like I
much.
say, if you want to do, you know, if you're interested in doing some of this reporting, and we've got lots of people on our team and lots of resources that might be useful, happy to share.
Well, I
Awesome.
think we'll definitely be checking it out.
Great.
And Lynn, did you want to come in and say something to sign us out? Lynn?
Lynn, I think she said she's lost. She doesn't know where her Hollywood Square is.
Oh, I think. Well, then I'll make the pitch for her. Give money to the Commons. She has a much more tactful way of saying it than I do, but that's basically the point. So thank you all, everyone, for coming. That was wonderful to have you. And thanks for the questions. And good night.